Yeah, my most recent book, a book that I'm very proud to announce, and I think it's a great honor for me that this publisher chose to publish this book, is this one, The Nevermind Girl and Other Stories. It has an interesting background because I work as an oral storyteller as well as a writer. I've written a lot of stuff because I've been requested to write, and often, you know, it's good that the clients like what I write, but because I work quite extensively in education, I work in entertainment as well as in education, with all kinds of community organizations, within schools, and at all levels. I work with very young children, with primary schools, with secondary schools, with teacher training, with adults, with corporates. But what happened is that I live in Singapore, and I've been in Singapore for the past 30 years. So something happened which, there was a conversation with a friend, and it made me reflect on the fact that some of the issues that we have faced in childhood, not just in childhood but also within the education system, haven't changed. And to me as an educator, it's really very, very important always to address some very, very basic issues about what education really is. And to me, I'm a very passionate educator because and I don't consider education to be constrained by the formal system. It should not. Education is certainly not only about the school system or, you know, defined by ministries. To me, education is really about what does it mean to be a human being. And that's an issue which to me is very, very simple, but which often gets forgotten. And because I work with young children, and very young children all the time, so it helps me to keep afresh some of those very, to me, I think, not just basic, but really key impulses in the way we address the world. And one of the basic things, I mean, one of the first questions children ask is why? I mean, what and why? And the basic, very basic questions. Sometimes as we get very, you know, as we grow older and we seem to be achieving a lot, we tend to forget our basic and most important impulses. So when I heard that, when I realized that the same things, the same kind of issues such as prejudice, such as bullying, such as issues of identity, issues of self and community and what is the purpose of life and why are we here, these were not being addressed. It was clear. I was just stirred enough by this, you know, by the fact that there was one child who was, to me, going through a difficult time in primary school because of, you know, these kind of related issues. I was stirred enough to create an oral story. Many of the oral stories I tell or retell are from, you know, folklore from around the world. But this was not folklore at all. And I mean, I have created contemporary fiction, but this was about telling a story that I really thought was important. And so I told it. It was a very simple oral story, and oral storytelling in the way we work in contemporary societies where time is always short, are short. So it was like less than a 10-minute story, 5 to 8 minutes. And the character there was called the Nevermind Girl. It encapsulated a little, you know, some of my own experiences when in my childhood, the experiences that my children have been through, and now, as I said, this young child was going through again. And so that was just one story. And it happened that I was invited to represent Singapore in South Africa at one of the events there, and this publisher had supported us all, and he too he had not been able to attend it. So after I attended the event, I went back to see him, and just in gratitude showed him the kind of work I do, and he had never seen me before. So he flipped through my work, and I just happened to have a text version of this oral story just for my working notes over there, and it seemed to register with him. He looked at it and he said, "I like this. Do you have other stories like this?" he said. And I said, "Oh yes, I do." And he said, "Yes, of the range of types of stories that I've done and the range of writing that I've done, he seemed to want that one." And I was really deeply honored because this is a publisher who, even when there wasn't a whole lot of support for the arts, all through the years has stood his ground supporting the artist and the right of the artist to honestly represent what he or she feels needs to be done. There were times when it was not always well supported. There were times sometimes when it could even be dangerous, but there were, and society changes. Now we are very grateful that there's a lot of support for the arts. But I think artists need to also be a bit wary. If there's too much support, it can also be a constraint. And one must try to essentially be true. So when this publisher, who I know has a conscience, basically what draws me to him is that this publisher is known to be a publisher with a conscience. So he gave me the freedom to just tell the stories I wanted, and then it happened that I was also beginning to consider Buckaroo. At that time there was discussion about coming to Buckaroo. So I finished up the other 15 stories, and this book came out just at the Singapore Writers' Festival. And what was interesting to me again is before the book came out, of course, people were asking about it, and I sent it off to various people. The book, ostensibly, I just loosely say it's for tweens and teens, because the issues are actually relevant not just to children, preschool children or primary school children, but certainly for teenagers. And I've discovered that a lot of adults and teachers read this, and my own friends of my age, they read it, and they came back to me and they said, it's an extraordinary thing, because when I read the story, I can see you and your daughter and your home, and I can see me and my mother and my home, and they keep morphing, and I can't tell whose story it is. So to me, that there is something that resonates, I think. So even at the launch, I was very happy to find that even though the launch was sort of somewhat later during the festival, a child had picked it up. Because it was displayed in the bookshop, a child had picked it up. Someone who had never heard of me before, someone who I had never seen, had picked up the book, taken it home, and apparently the child, and this was a young child, probably between 6 and 8, and she'd read it, she'd loved it, she spoke of it to her mother, and her mother really felt that it was important. She brought both the girls, and she came for the launch. So, and she said to me that it meant a lot to her. So that's why this book means a lot to me as well. The main character is Anna, and she's a teenage girl who is not your brilliant girl. She's actually a very somewhat shy, quiet girl, but she has a mind of her own, and she certainly has a heart. And so she does her very best to be a good girl within the school system. She tries her best to follow, the roles assigned to her. But there's always a point at which she begins to question. And so it talks about the fact that she feels that she's a little out of sync with society around her, because she doesn't seem to be interested in some of the issues that seem to matter to people around her. She feels that she and her family are a little strange, and I discovered that a lot of teenagers actually feel that way, because each of them feels that people don't really understand me and I'm different inside. So I think that's what this is about. So Anna is the protagonist, and she has a sister and she has twin brothers, and there are issues with her mom and dad as well. And her mother too, again, her mother too believes that there is a purpose for education, and it's about, there is a reason to be happy, that as human beings we're not just constantly striving in clamoring, striving, desperate always. There has to be some kind of peace within us. We have to make peace with ourselves about who we are and what our purpose is. It does not preclude effort or striving, but there has to be a sense of why, what is the purpose, so that there is a direction, and that all our actions are focused on something, that we achieve something of meaning. So really, essentially as a storyteller, I work a lot with the idea of the tension between fact and fiction and truth and story. People tend to be very obsessed with facts. And there are so many people who, because facts are, are in some way ascertainable, or numbers can be counted. You know, they're interested in the bottom line. They want the measurables. They want the things that can be counted. But there's so much. We all know actually that it's the things that can't be counted that are the more important things in life. But we constantly seem to be forgetting about it in society, in education, in various aspects of our lives. So this idea that there has to be a reason, and sometimes fiction can reveal a deeper truth than fact alone can. Because as a storyteller, I know that it's not, whether it's words or it's numbers, words or numbers can tell any story you wanted to tell. So it's very important to know what is your story and what is a story you would like to be the story of your life. What is the purpose? What is the meaning of your life? You know, what is your real true story? The one that takes you through all the different challenges that you might possibly face in your life. The idea of the story came out because, you know, as I heard things that were happening around me, and I was stirred enough and concerned enough to do something about it. Because it's important. I feel that every individual is important, and you have to do, you know, be the change was something that we knew in our childhood. So, and I realized that it wasn't, nobody was addressing this question, and that's why, as I said, I told it as an oral story to, you know, a whole assembly of school children. And I'm an entertainer as a storyteller, and there are lots of very, very funny stories that I tell. But people make the mistake that children are not engaged by serious stuff. Actually, children do consider serious stuff. They like to be entertained, but sometimes we like our hearts to be touched. We like our minds to be stirred. We want our passions to be on fire as well. And children have passions. Children have desires. They need inspiration to carry on with their lives. And they need the courage to face their fears. So that was, in a sense, the trigger, the impetus for the book. But also because I work in the oral tradition often, to me it was not creating so much a literary work that is, to me it was trying to try and tell the story as simply and honestly as I could. And so it, as I say sometimes, it's not so much a work of art in the sense that I didn't slap on literary flourishes, or which anyway no decent writer would. But it's not a work of art so much as a work of heart. And it's very reassuring to find that various people who've read it seem to connect with it, and many of them seem to think that it is their story. So it is actually based on the experiences that not just I have gone through, but many people in our generation have gone through, and many people even today go through. It happened when the story was sent to the illustrator. There was no brief given to her about how it should be represented, but she happened to pick this up because it is set in primarily about school. I have many plans for this, for Anna and her family, because they will continue to explore. They will continue to explore the important things that need to be explored. Some of these don't have answers. This question is not about providing answers or easy answers. It's not about reassurance or taking the easy way out. It's about the reassurance that yes, you have the right to question, and as a human being, as a thinking, feeling human being, you should question, because only then are you creating value for yourself and meaning for your life. Because I work so much with children, and when I say I'm a storyteller, many adults make the mistake that I entertain children, and they think it's a convenient babysitter, and you know, it's children's stuff. You write simple stories, you do funny stuff with the kids, and they're entertained, and then they can go shopping or something. They forget that actually children's stories are very deep, because traditionally fables which use animals have never meant to be children's stories at all. The fables are a particular vehicle, a form of narrative that actually addresses very deep issues, and the point of putting animals into them is just to sort of dissociate itself from issues like race and gender and religion and all that, and to get to the essence of the particular character, you know, the point of the story, the particular value or the particular the form of action that you should that could be considered. So for me, I always say that a really good book, however simple it is, can address all ages. And as an adult too, some of my in fact, my journey as a storyteller, my journey as an educator began quite incidentally when I was doing something with children, and I picked up the very old traditional story of the magic fish. It was an unusual book because I have heard the story in my childhood, and I, growing up in India, assumed it was, in my head, it was an Indian story. I've come across children, and anyway, that book was written so beautifully, so simply, so succinct the story was, that I said, oh my goodness, I know this story. This is the story of my life. And I've told that story so many, many times. And what's very interesting for me is that I tell it to very young children. It is very simple. It has certain elements of repetition, but it builds up. And every time is the question, why? How much is enough? And why do you want more? And this keeps going on. And I have used that story with very young children. I've used it with teenagers. I've used it with adults and, teachers. And I've used it with in corporates. And every time, everyone understands it at their level. I was once supposed to be doing something for teachers of primary school children, and it happened for a variety of reasons that somebody very important was coming, and in the end, only the senior people from education were there. So instead of having preschool teachers who were looking for a story for young children, but I used the exact same story. The exact same story. And I told it exactly as I would in a class, because I was demonstrating to them that this is how I would tell it to young children. But I said, but I would like you to address it as adults. Let the story do its work in your head. And then we explored it, in a workshop, and the sharing that came out was astounding, because basically it goes back to this. We were so harried, we lead such busy lives, we're so harried, we're so tense, we're so anxious, and we're running around frantically doing all kinds of stuff. We never stop to think, to be, and to assess why and how much, right? What is the purpose? So when I tell to young children, I like to use a very simple style, but it's very interesting that at about the same time I had this book for children, which is written simply, and then another book that came out was Balik Kampong, which had a very interesting premise as well, but written for adults. And only if I compare them, I recognize that this possibly, adults might recognize that this is a literary story in a sense. I would not be just telling it orally, but this is a children's story that has bandwidth. It's possibly what you'd call a crossover story. And so many people who've responded to it have been adults. So a good story is for every human being.